All right, here we are. Okay. Welcome everybody to the first listening book launch. I would like to thank you everybody for being here. I would like to thank you all the contributors here, Anna Sherbany, Nick Couldry, Jana, and Chris from the Ultra Red, and Tati and Margareta from Precarious Worker Brigade. I would like to thank Housmans Bookshop for hosting this event. And yes, so the evening will be structured as follow. We're gonna, yeah.
One quick announcement.
Yes.
For people sitting here. Yeah, just. I don't know. Maybe you can hear me. Can you hear me? Just briefly, those people who are sitting on the edge here, just to be aware that the bookshelves are a little bit precarious.
Are we? Everything is precarious.
There's also one seat at the front, and the toilet is just at the back on the right. Oh, no, well, somebody's. Yeah, there are a couple of seats at the front.
So yes, we will talk. Claudia and I will do a short introduction about the book, the genesis of the book, and then we will open up to our interlocutor or contributor, and we will have an open discussion. So we aim at finishing around 8:30, and then to leave enough an hour for drinks and some salad, hopefully. So to start with the genesis. When I started discussing with Brandon Labelle and Riccardo Benassi the possibility to contribute to their new series, Dormat, which is a new series as part of Errant Bodies Press, I realized that I didn't want to write a book about listening on my own, because the most interesting things about listening in that period, in 2011, where the most interesting things I observed were in St. Paul during the Occupy, seeing people speaking and listening to each other. And at the time I was collaborating with Claudia. Claudia and I were part of many initiatives at the time. In particular, we were involved in the workshop with the Precarious Worker Brigade. So we ran 3 workshops during Occupy. And so the book started very much reflecting about those experiences. It started from practice more than theory. However, another important another important element of the book was the interview with Adriana Cavarero, Italian philosopher, feminist. I interviewed in 2011. And Adriana interview was not done originally for the book, but it turned out to be very useful to actually understand the work of many collectives in the moment, and above all, her reading of Hannah Arendt, a notion of action, was very helpful to discuss the idea of direct action and voice in political space. So, so we started very much to think about the role of listening at the intersection of art and activism. We started to talk to our friends and comrade and colleague, and the first interview was with the member of Ultra Red, and it was clear since this conversation that the legacy of consciousness raising in dialogical practice, in political dialogical practice, was very important. So, and it was Ultra Red really helped us at the beginning to map the trajectory. So we decided to actually interview and have talks with 2 women that were part of those groups in the 70s, and Anna Sherbany, artist Anna Sherbany, and anthropologist Pat Kaplan contribute to that book through their narratives. And it was very interesting for us. It was very clear that in order to understanding the relationship between micropolitics and listening, consciousness raising was very much a key point to go back to and discuss. Although this book is coming first and foremost from practice, we actually use theory to support and develop our argument. And beside Adriana Cavarero was very important the conversation that we have with Nick, media theorist, a conversation about his book Why Voice Matter. And that was very helpful to picture the value of voice and listening and how this can challenge and neoliberal politics, and Nick probably will say more tonight. And discussion of notion of recognition and solidarity was also very important point that we discussed with Nick. And Nick introduced us to the work of the philosopher Susan Bickford that she wrote about listening and political theory, and that was very inspiring book, because through that book we start thinking about listening in situation of disagreement, and something that perhaps we might want to discuss more tonight. So in 2014 we interview Precarious Worker Brigade. We have a conversation. Probably most of you know the Precarious Worker Brigade, but for people who doesn't know them, is a collective of cultural activists who came together in 2011 to address the issue of working condition and precarity. And Precarious Worker Brigade offer us much political ground from which to start our collaboration and reflect above all about the role of listening in group formation. So we also interview Arina Anastasia and Gabri, two artists that have been involved in many collective initiatives within the art context, such as 16 Beaver, there's an artisan space in New York, and more recently this platform called And there was 100 days of discussion and gathering during Documenta 13. So it was very interesting to compare those perspectives from art and political practice. So there are other conversations which have been very helpful in the book, but which are not included, because we really opted to focus on collaborative practice at intersection of art activism. So we give priority to the collaborative and collective work. So, coming to the structure of the book, very briefly, the Force of Listening is an experimental book, it's not an academic book. It's constructed as a long conversation in 8 acts, so we actually use the recording, and they recorded the conversation, we transcribe them, and we arrange in a montage in 8 chapters. And the book owns montage and dialogic form to Carla Lonzi's Autoritratto. Carla Lonzi was a feminist writer and an art historian who wrote this book through a collage of interview. And the book was very inspiring for us, not only in its form, but also as a symbolic threshold between art and activism, because Carla Lonzi, after that book, she established the first consciousness raising group in Italy. So it was a very interesting passage from art to activism. So like in Autoritratto, our interlocutor meets on the page, but tonight we have the great privilege to have actually them here. So we hope to continue the conversation. And before to pass to Claudia, that she will talk more about listening, why listening, and main point about listening, I want to say that in the process of writing this book, I had quite a few adversity. So I feel very emotional tonight, but I'm very happy to be here and celebrate this with you. And I would like to thank all the friends, they've been very supportive, and my partner as well has been really wonderful. And I would like to thank Claudia, because she's been the most faithful and great collaborator. And although in certain moment we thought we will never reach an end, because the montage was just a nightmare, where we put this, what is there, we actually managed to do it. So I'm very glad that this little book now is in our hand. Thank you.
Okay, so before I talk about main points of on listening, I also want to do a few thank yous. Yeah, thank you first of all to Lucia, who invited me to be part of the project. It's, I think, something that both of us have felt really has been very important for us, and I so jumped at the chance of being able to do it. And yeah, it's been a roller coaster, a very slow, long roller coaster. But I'm so happy as well that it now exists. It's really great to see. And also, as well as thanking the people that could make it, I also want to thank
the contributors that couldn't make it this evening. Pat Kaplan, Robert Sember, Irina Nastas and Rennie Gabry. Pat has sent an email which I'll read out in a minute. I also want to thank everyone else who's been part of the book. We really needed a lot of copy editing, and there are unsung heroes. So we want to thank those people and the people who transcribed some of our interviews, and proofreaders, including my dad, who's just sitting here in the front row. And then also, of course, our publisher, Brandon LaBelle at Errant Bodies Press, without whom we wouldn't be able to do it. So they've been great. So I'm going to just read an email from Pat. We asked her if she wanted to contribute, and so she sent us a short email. So I'm just going to read it out, and then I'll talk a little bit more. Dear Lucia and Claudia, thank you for asking me to contribute to the book launch, as well as for the original invitation to be interviewed and so contribute to the book. For women of my generation, it is heartening to know that there are still feminist movements out there, and even more pleasing to find that some of their members are interested in what we did and thought in the 1970s and 1980s, and how the feminist movement linked at that time to struggles around race and class. Of course, each generation has to rediscover the important issues, but it often seems to me that if we do not learn from previous generations, we risk repeating mistakes, not to mention reinventing the wheel. So I'm glad you've not fallen into that trap. This book highlights the importance of listening, what I would call active listening, in which one is fully engaged with the speaker and what she is saying and thinks about it afterwards. This active listening has lessons in many parts of life. If Kensington and Chelsea Borough, for example, had listened to the Grenfell Tower residents' concerns, maybe the fire could have been averted. If Blair had listened to the anti-war protests, maybe Iraq would not now be in the mess it is. So I hope your book encourages more of this active listening. Once again, many congrats, and I hope the launch is a great success. Sorry I can't be there. So I'm going to just say a few key pointers before we move on to our contributors. I think one of the things was that both myself and Lucia came to listening from slightly different perspectives. Lucia more from sound and sound art, and myself through a peer counselling organisation that I was part of for many years. But we converged, our interests converged through a number of points that we were in that allowed us to write the book. In particular, we're interested in listening not as an end in itself, but as a relational practice. So Lucia has mentioned this a little bit already. So alongside speaking. In political theory, there's a lot of emphasis on voice, on speech acts. And so by thinking about listening, it kind of changes the dynamic to thinking about reception and receptivity. And alongside that, we were interested in thinking of it, because I think if you think of receptivity, it may then sound passive. But we were interested in it as being active, as being an action. It can feel, I think, a little bit like listening is about becoming an empty vessel that someone's going to kind of dump a load of stuff in. But listening is a conscious decision, something that can be cultivated, as opposed to hearing, which is the physiological act that happens. And you can't close your ears, but you can decide whether to listen or not, and how to listen as well. So we wanted to explore listening as a political tool, how listening might change dynamics, how it might destabilise power relations, how it might contribute to solidarity. Lucia has mentioned Susan Bickford, who's one of the few political theorists who actually write about listening, although I'm noticing that now there's quite a few new things coming out about listening. There's a new book just come out quite recently, and a few more people writing about it, so that's quite exciting. But one of the things that Susan Bickford talked about was listening as a bridge or a pathway that needs to be constructed by both people involved in order to go on a journey, to travel on it. And I think both myself and Lucia really liked this idea, and that was a kind of beginning point for our journey to write the book, and for our kind of relationship while we were collaborating. And the other thing, of course, Lucia's talked a little bit about consciousness raising as a practice, and I think one of the things we were interested in taking from that was feminist ethics. So the ethics that are embedded in listening as a relational practice. So that's, again, to go against the heroic solo speech act, and instead think about interdependence, care and responsibility. And we were interested in extending this to a kind of wider domain, so not just that of gender issues, although of course gender issues are really important, but we really think that feminism and can go far beyond that, and particularly in terms of putting a certain kind of ethics into politics, and to issues around organisation, formation, and so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to trace a legacy back to consciousness raising practices. And something that Lucia has reminded me about often is of the importance of the sonic, of sound. That's not the background that I come from, but certainly what she's reminded me of is that the sonic links to affect and links to bodily. It talks about bodily connections as well as just discourse or language, and that also seems to play a very important role, in particular in creating solidarity. So the title comes from some of these thoughts, some of these ideas. So the force of listening is its potential. So that comes from the Latin potentia. So rather than any kind of violence, although that might also be possible. Certainly if I sat in a room with someone and said, I will listen to you until you agree with me, then that has its own kind of violence. And certainly for me, just like Pat, in light of recent political situations with Grenfell, the rise of the alt-right, Trump, Brexit, it seems that listening has become even more imperative than ever, and particularly to understand, I think there's two things for me personally, to understand how institutions and power might listen to those who do not normally have a voice, but also to ask how we might continue to listen in spaces of difference and open ourselves up to change. So hopefully we're going to discuss some of these issues this evening with our guests. There's a lot of us, so I don't know how this is going to quite go. And as Lucia said, so that people finally meet in person rather than just on the page. So, yeah.
We could start with Nick.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Nick Couldry, and I'm really pleased to be involved in the book, and thanks to Lucia and Claudia for all the work. I got involved because I've written about voice. I wrote a book called Why Voice Matters from 2010, which was really an attempt at some general philosophical level to tap into some resources for standing up against the situation with the late years of New Labour, where I felt completely unrepresented. And out of personal need, I really had to write a book that put some resources together for me, just as Milton Friedman, when he invented the concept of neoliberalism, said we need to put the resources aside so that when our moment comes, we can use them. A famous passage quoted by Naomi Klein. And the book was called Why Voice Matters, so you might think they got the wrong guy. They shouldn't have asked me. But actually, I didn't want to call it that. I wanted to call it Voice That Matters, after Judith Butler. It's very important in the book. The whole point is that we know why voice matters. The point is, is it allowed to matter? What stops it mattering? Well, the publishers stopped me calling it that because they said they couldn't understand the concept. So that dealt with that. So I almost changed publisher, but I didn't in the end. But the key point is that this very idea of voice that matters is it already trips people up. It's not so easy. So the whole book is a book about voice not seen in isolation from the individual point of view, but thinking about how different society, politics, the world would be if voice was actually valued, if it was actually taken into account, if things were actually organized on the basis that voice does matter. Of course, we're told it matters all the time. That's meant to be the basis of democracy. But in fact, all the time it's based on the principle that in fact it doesn't matter. So what would it be to think about a world that was organized on that principle? In other words, to call democracy's bluff. And one way to think about that, the simplest, is to think about listening. Because that's the simplest bodily way in which we can register, we can make matter someone's voice to us, if we do it properly, that is. And that really simple starting point, that listening is the basic but also the most important and fundamental way of treating voice as if it mattered, brings out right away for me the key point I want to emphasize, which is that why the principle of listening is so important, why it has such provocative force, as you say, is because it challenges us to imagine how differently the world would have to be organized if it was really going to be organized on the basis that voice matters. So that's what the book's about. That's what it attempts, just in a startling way, to think about. And specifically, if we take that principle, and it's expressed in the phrase, the force of listening, it specifically challenges us to start, obviously, to organize things that way, or at least start to think about what it might mean, what we would stop doing, what we would start to do. And that, of course, opens up a big subject which is all very tangible and obvious to us, which is the deficit of listening in contemporary societies, the deficit of voice. And we live in societies which are now organized formally around the principle of voice at every level, but they constantly offer less than voice. They constantly offer less than actually the promise of listening to voice. So listening is the principle that calls the bluff of that challenges the deficit and challenges, therefore, the very basis of contemporary societies and the idea that they operate on anything like the democratic principles they say they operate on as their special feature. And of course, I wrote the book originally about neoliberalism, which seemed all-enveloping at the time, and it still is in some ways. But this general principle about voice is a much older one than that. It applies on every level. It applies to relationships, institutions, and hence the link back to feminism. It applies to conscientization in the 1970s, Paulo Freire, although not using exactly that word. This is the point of principle. What if people were listened to? How different would the classroom be? So it's an extraordinarily wide-ranging voice, but it's also very prevalent, very poignant for the current moment. And the thing, of course, that we really want to know is not just what the principle of voice and listening, but what listening would mean in practice if it became a political principle. We're only, I think, beginning to get a full idea, and the Grenfell was a sort of example, if you like, in reverse, of how disruptive, how powerful a principle listening could be. And so that's why I'm very excited to be part of this book, because I see it's just the start of a very long process that continues and recognizes people who have tried along the same path in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can hear from the Ultra Red. So Jana and Chris are here.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for having us here and also including us in this really amazing book. For us, it's incredibly useful to have a space to kind of reflect on our own practice and also to have it situated in the intersections with so many other voices, some of whom we've been in conversation with for many years and others who are kind of new voices within our own practice. For those of you who don't know about Ultra Red, we've been a collective working, I guess, at the intersection of sound, art, and politics. That's what we usually say, although I think we're working at other intersections most of the time. But anyway, for like more than 20 years, there's 12 members of us. So every time a couple of us speak, we always have to acknowledge the absence of our comrades who are on other continents and in other struggles as we speak. So I guess one of the things that we thought, we had two things we wanted to reflect on in the book that we thought were really useful, because our own kind of grounding, I suppose, comes from a number of intersections, most certainly from feminist practices as they were read within queer practices in the US. So a number of members of our group were involved in ACT UP, so is founding members in different cities of ACT UP, so they were very much informed by queer feminist practices in those moments of listening and of sort of thinking and organizing together. But also a number of us come from histories of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle, and so for us listening, we read and heard kind of about listening through those organizing practices. So while we say we're a sound and political collective, we're also a collective that comes out of histories of community organizing. And for us, this question that comes up in the book, and I really appreciated Anna and Pat's kind of contribution where you ask them about the protocol. And you sort of say, you know, what protocols were the consciousness-raising groups using? And was it you, Anna, who said protocol? Like, we didn't use the word protocol. And for us, this is a really important question because it's a term we use all the time in Ultra Red, but have used it to try and, like, chart what are these practices of listening, what are these protocols of listening that are unacknowledged within political spaces, often unacknowledged. And that, for us, is something that we really drew from feminist movements, from Joe Freeman asking about the tyranny of structurelessness, from all of these kinds of questions about how are the spaces of listening organized, how are the spaces of politics organized, who's speaking, who's not speaking. But this also leads on to questions which are to do with power, obviously, but also to do with both the human and, I suppose, non-human entities that are involved in organizing, like this microphone I'm holding. How does this microphone orient the space of listening? How does it organize our relations to each other? How does a circle, how does a cup of tea, how do all of these different elements that come into political practice but are often completely unacknowledged and invisibilized, often because they're deemed as sort of women's practices, as is listening, how do they kind of, how does acknowledging those different kinds of protocols allow us to start to change them and to sort of actively politicize spaces in ways that don't privilege voice over listening, that don't privilege sort of certain kinds of speakers over others, that start to negotiate the contradictions of power as they exist in spaces at their most micro and most macro kind of forms. So there's that kind of question of the protocol and bringing up the protocol, naming it, and sort of disputing it on a certain level is important for us. I think, Chris, you were going to say something also about the kind of discomfort of naming protocols as well.
Oh, was I?
That's right there. Do you want me to say that?
You said that.
Okay. So, but also one of the things that in our work, because having worked both within different histories of community struggle and political struggle, but also having read those histories and having looked in them for the protocols, in a very much the way you guys did around feminist consciousness raising, like who was sitting where, what did they say, how did they ask each other, how long did you spend, you know, those kinds of questions which are often sort of seen to be not so important, but are actually shaping political experience. We sort of read histories to try and find those kinds of practices, those kinds of protocols. So, for example, Ella Baker, who was a really significant member of SNCC in the United States and the Civil Rights Movement, talked endlessly about sort of going and meeting people and listening and sort of converting what she heard and other members of SNCC heard into the kind of political framework of SNCC. And so So those kinds of like durational kind of encounters where people listen to each other, or where they listen in particular ways, were really crucial to us. But in implementing protocols for listening within our own social movements and political movements that we've been a part of, we also noticed that there was a real tension when those get named. When a protocol is named and sort of suggested as a framework for facilitation, how that produces different resistances and different kind of reactions, and how different groups, depending how invested they are in the questions of political change, relate to those protocols. And so I think that's something maybe to think about, is sort of like, you know, drawing out attention to practices of listening, but then also thinking about how people respond when you do sort of articulate them, when you do say, this is what's happening in this space, because actually they start to produce quite significant conflicts at that moment. Sometimes very productive and generative conflicts, and sometimes not so much. So that's all I'm going to say.
Oh, well, I can't hear anything. So I was going to make a second point, but I also want to say thanks to Lucia and Claudia for this book, great book. And yeah, our Ultra being in that book is very important to us. I was going to say a second point really, which is talking through some of the things Ultra Red does, which is, we can't really explain everything that we do, but we do sometimes a thing called a listening session with all sorts of different communities, and that really involves sitting in silence, listening to particular sound recordings from particular struggles, and asking the question, what did you hear? So that seems quite simple, that you might play, for example, either the sound of a police car or a demonstration or someone talking, and to ask people, what did you hear? And then you expect this moment of articulating something that you've heard in that recording. But I think all of us increasingly are understanding that maybe it's in that moment of articulation and there's a tension. And so I've done many listening sessions which bring up exactly the things Jana said, of these kind of tensions around the protocol, why these particular sound recordings, the fact that we are the authors of these sound recordings, or we have chosen them. So if we stick to this kind of mode of the listening session and the moment where there's a silence, some of that tension is both good and bad around this question, which is, there's a moment where you've listened to something quite intense, you're silent in a group of people that maybe you know or don't know, and there are different levels that why you come together. You might be a group in formation, you might be a group in reflection. But there's a moment that's very embodied, and I find this, we had this experience in Cologne where we kind of did a listening session for the group itself, so we all played sounds from our particular struggles, and it was quite an intense moment emotionally just to hear these kind of things that moved people within the group. So there's this kind of very embodied moment, you know, this kind of non-articulation of what we heard. And I don't know how you deal with it, how you flip from one thing to another. And I think to me this is something I'm really interested in. How you flip from kind of sweating a bit because you've heard something that moved you or triggered something or doesn't move you and you're worried about what you're supposed to say. How do we actually move through that listening to response into a kind of a moment of articulation which demands that you are in fact articulate, that you can describe what you've heard. But I'm also interested in this moment of silence then, because we use silence a lot. At the end of that listening session we often just play a sound recording of silence to situate ourselves back in the room, which is a very powerful moment. And I was thinking through this idea that there's actually a listening to our listening, which is really, really important, because we are kind of, well, there's a visual cue of seeing how people are, but there is a kind of collective listening to our listening, which that silent recording often brings about. So if we think through something, I also think of like the pauses that you get when you're listening, those kind of, the sense of time that is really important, because politics is often this firefight, this rush. Creating this sense of time, these pauses, these not filling the gaps, seems to me also an important part of listening. And I was thinking also about silence itself, the kind of history of silence, which is entwined through some of the things that are written about in the book. And it struck me quite forcefully. I went to I don't know if other people went, there was a Grenfell Tower silent march where everybody gathered and moved very, very painfully slowly towards the tower in incredibly baking hot sun, and how that was really, really amazing moment of actually what we were doing, we're just listening to something. We didn't even know, but we were together listening. And there were some tensions around, particularly guys saying, why the fuck are we silent? Like, why are we being silent? We should be angry. And that was really amazingly dealt with by the community saying, well, we have chosen this thing. And it appeared 3 or 4 times. Someone actually came with a megaphone and was like, we are not going to be silenced. And people said, this is not about being silenced, this is an active silence. That was a really amazing moment, and it ties to some of the things written about in the book, the kind of use of silence in the civil rights movement way back also in 1919 in Harlem, the silent march through Harlem of the black population against lynchings, and then other moments of how silence was used within feminist practice as well. Recognizing that it wasn't being silenced to be silent. There's an active power actually in being silent, in not responding, for example, to power. And I also think for something we also touched on earlier, which is this listening to our listening is some way to privilege not waiting to perform the clever thing you're going to say. So that listening to the listening to me was a way of unwrapping these painful moments of listening sessions where you have this embodied moment and then people specialise and they're very clever and they perform. And this is exactly what we're trying to not do with listening. We're actually trying, as you said, to actively listen to each other, to make a space, to recognise who we are in the room, how we got there, what privileges we have, what privileges we don't have, what oppressions are in the room. So I kind of like this, the listening to our listening is just some moment. But of course we also at some point, we can't remain in silence. We have to, as ACT UP said, as we play with all the time, silence equals death. So at some point you have to respond. But how do we actually move through these questions of silence and listening and embodiment? So that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to pass on to Precarious Workers Brigade now. If you can't think of
Quite a lot of us here.
I mean, you don't both have to say, and if you don't want to, it's totally up to you.
Thank you to Lucia and Claudia, but also to Jana and Chris and Nick and Anne. I'm kind of here hiding, but I also feel like it's appropriate because in the book we're actually not our names, so you will see the names of people. So I wanted to say that, hi, my name is, and I'm looking for names, Chloe, Mila, Alex, where is the rest? I'm also Lucia, I'm also Claudia, I'm also Tati. The reason why I'm saying that is because when I got the book a few weeks ago, Lucia kindly gave it to me, and I started reading what we said. I had no idea what were my words. I still can't tell you. Either you've been very good at the chopping and editing, and it made me really, I felt quite moved by that. I felt quite moved by the fact that I had no idea who I was in here, and this has also been my experience of being in the collective. I'm getting very emotional now, because it's really taught me a lot, and a lot of it is embodied, and I haven't quite articulated it. So that's when we gathered, when Claudia and Lucia invited us to come to a meeting where we're going to talk about our experiences of working collectively. The invitation was, and I think it was the first time we had the space to listen to each other and the space to reflect on how we worked together and what we did together. For me, that was the first time we did that. And it was very surprising because I thought, oh my God, so we actually haven't made the time for ourselves to listen to each other collectively and about how we work. So this book is really a chance to put that into paper. So I thank you for all the work and for the space that you've created for all of us as a collective. So that's really what I felt like. Yeah, it was really important space. So thank you.
So I think one of the little things I wanted to remember about that day as well, I think it was maybe about the first year when I just joined PWB, and I started to get involved because future interns were there. We were doing silent direct actions in the museums. I was actually surprised to hear now actually there were silent actions. We decided consciously we're not going to say much unless we have to negotiate with the managers on this health and safety processes. But at that time when Claudia and Lucia created that space for PWB to come together and think about the group, for me it was one of the strange experiences and first experiences of being within that unusual space of listening
for me it was I think one of the most important steps in terms of learning what PWB was and how this amazing group has been operating, and the kind of culture that people who have been involved have been trying to create. And in that sense, I've looking at that from maybe about 5 years after perspective, and I got much more involved with the cooperative movement. I think learning that happens through collectives that are listening, of collectives of people that are trying to practice different forms of listening and forms of active listening is really important for creating alternative institutions and building up radical institutions that can challenge the existing hierarchical structures. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll just pass the microphone on to Anna.
Yeah, I think that thank you very much for including me in the book. I feel very honoured to be part of it, and for my words to sort of be on a page, even though we're talking about listening. I think that for me, the feminist movement with consciousness raising was very much about. Can you hear what I'm saying? No. Can you hear it now? Yeah. Okay. So this is how much I've learnt about. Right. So
you go quite close if you want.
No, this is close enough. So that's what's ironic about it. That while I sort of feel on the one hand that being part of the consciousness raising group and many other groups beyond after that, you're going to hold it for me, aren't you? That taught me that my words actually have some value in certain situations. I still feel utterly terrified of sitting here and saying things out aloud. But in smaller groups, I feel much more confident. And it's really interesting because it's made me think about a lot of things. So thank you very much for that. And in many respects, my feminism really sort of informed my work. And I suppose what I've been thinking while I've been listening to everybody is that the images, I use sort of images in my work and now video and now more recently sound. And in a way, the images that I made and the series of images that I made, I hope were actually speaking to people. So it was a different form of sound for me. So people could actually see the work and perhaps see something that they identified with, which was always informed by my feminism in one way or another. Whether it was about appearance, was it about the way that we look that informs the way that we're actually seen. And I also felt that involved men as well as women. And more recently, I feel that having actually added sound into my work, probably, I think I started that in about 2004 or 2003, 2004, where there was actual sound in the work, and that remains being informed in the sense that I feel that actually giving people space to feel that what they have to say is important and that other people will listen to it. So much of the work that I've been doing over the last few years has been about asking people to say things. While I think I control it in the sense of choosing the subject, choosing the way that it's actually presented, I actually don't choose the words that they're actually saying. So much so that when I did a piece in Palestine with parents giving their children stories of their childhood, I couldn't understand Arabic, so I had absolutely no idea what they were saying. So I literally trusted them to be saying something. So the words are, of course, important, but the space that I give to people, or that I'm providing, I'm not giving it, I'm creating that space that is important to me because it's about the work that I then present, is hopefully making them feel that what they have to say has an importance, and that those are the words that people need to listen to. I suppose from a sort of oral history background, where people realised that there were lots of people that hadn't been heard, and that was very important. And in some respects, that has also sort of influenced my work, and that's what I feel needs to continue. I can't remember. I don't know. One person sort of said this at one point. I don't know that what makes me very sad is that so much of the voices that did come out of the feminist movement actually disappeared. And I felt, to a large extent, that the whole thing had to start again. And I don't know, I don't think it's to do with the women that were involved or the people that were involved. I think there's actually a very definite sort of move to silence those voices, and the way that those voices are silenced is a sort of tokenistic approach to sort of feeling that, oh, well, women have been given that, and women have been given this, so the voices don't need to be heard anymore. I don't think that's true. And I also don't think that the women's movement only spoke of women. It was actually speaking about many people whose voices don't get heard. And that's why I feel that this book is very important, just in terms of what it's saying. And my voice is cracking. I'm feeling quite sort of emotional about it. So I think that was it. There were some other bits, but I'm going to stop at this point. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you everybody for wonderful contribution. Very moving. Maybe we can, I don't know if you have any question to ask to each other, because maybe you listen to each other, maybe you have some question before we actually propose some question, and the public might have some question.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the last point, because listening is a very important principle, but it punctures so many other principles. It's so challenging to hold structures. And one way of linking to what you just said is that, we grow up with the myth that societies are built, they're constructed out of things, out of discourses, ideas, and so on. But probably more important is that they're built out of forgetting, enforced forgetting, which isn't named as silencing. It's just an inability to remember. And in fact, even when we have a conversation with someone, sometimes for good reasons, we talk over each other, we're excited, but that is forgetting what the person just said. And so the silence that allows the memory to continue into the space of the silence is extremely important to the conversation. In fact, without it, you can't have the conversation. But again, we forget that, because there's nothing in it. But it's what's not in it that is the important thing. So I think thinking about forgetting and how forgetting is enforced in so many circumstances is just as important. So that's, for me, one reason that silence, remembering one not saying anything that anyone can override, is a very powerful act, because you show that you're challenging the very principle by just walking through the streets. And of course, in Argentina, there are the wonderful, the mothers of the Placa de Mayo, who lost their sons and who said nothing while carrying a sign with the name of their son round the square again and again and again in the eye of power. They were speaking, but while at the same time refusing to speak in the discourse that was available to them, the one that was limited for them. And so silence can also be not talking in the available language, choosing another language. So I think it's good to talk about silence. What it means is good to talk about forgetting.
Yeah, I mean, I just started to read Judith Butler, Notes Towards a Performative Theory Assembly. Unfortunately, we didn't read it at the beginning when we were doing our book, but it came out in 2015, quite recently. But it's interesting that she talked about embodied action. And I think when you're talking about silence, it's the presence of the body in the street together that do something. So this embodied listening is very important. It's the presence of the body together. They do relate to each other in that way. So I think that it's a very interesting way to think about public sphere again, and how to and different mode of protesting and occupy the spaces. Yeah, I find very inspiring what this example of the demonstration in silence. Yeah, maybe Claudia, you want to?
I was just going to open it.
I was just going to open it up to see if anybody had any questions for anybody.
Yeah, there's a radio mic here.
Yeah,
so
we have a roving mic.
Wow. Yeah, so
Amazing.
just test it first and see whether.
Testing?
No.
It's green, but
It's on green.
It was working before.
Yeah, it was.
Hello. Oh, I've got to plug it in, haven't I? That would be good. I was terrified of feedback because feedback is when feedback is happening, there is silence after that. But if you let
terribly generous.
any of you sound artists here, and there's a few sound artists, people here, when feedback starts, that's when it gets interesting. If you can let that happen. Maybe not now. Okay, one.
Yes.
Probably don't need a mic.
But I'm recording it, so.
I want to speak loud. I've just come across a book by Kate Lacey called Politics of Listening, I think, and this idea of the freedom of listening as opposed to the freedom of speech. And I just wondered if this had come up or if anyone has something to say in response to that.
I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know.
Maybe I would like that. It's okay. Well, it's an interesting question. When I did the interview with Adriana Cavarero, I was trying to stress all of the time the listening because it was interesting to actually reverse. And then the way we think of, it's interesting the way she talked about voice in the book and dialogic practices, the reciprocity for speaking and listening. There is no, it's like she made the example of a theater where there is no actor and no spectator. So, and that, I think, she talked about consciousness raising at this kind of reciprocal act. But we know that the experience of consciousness raising in 70s were not perfect. There were also problems there. I mean, there were women that didn't want to speak. So that freedom of being silent, it was quite, for some women it was felt as a violence that, you have to go around and everybody have to tell the story. But if you didn't want to say anything, it was quite difficult. So this is why, the conscience raising in certain contexts, like in Italy, developed in different forms. Women started practicing the relation between women. They start setting up bookshop, doing practice, and living the speaking and living that kind of protocol of just going around and speak out your personal experience. And that was very interesting because you see how feminists actually shifted their practice, took into account that kind of crisis. And but I don't know. It's not like the idea is that keeping the thinking in terms of relationality. And if you're thinking about in terms of relationality, there's no priority of one to another. It's how you shape the relation and the power within the relation, I think.
I have thought of something.
Yeah.
Something that kept coming up in the book, actually, in conversations with people, was this idea of freedom of speech, and Nick has said a few things about this already, where it appears that there is a space for people to speak into, but I'm really not used to speaking with a mic. I don't know quite where to put it, but so that often these spaces are constructed where it's set up, where it's like, here is a space to speak into. This is where you can have a voice, and yet the boundaries of that space are incredibly tightly controlled, and that there's no consequences to that speaking. That something might be heard, but there's it's not allowed to leak out in any way. It's not allowed to come out of the little tick box. And certainly when we were speaking to Ultra Red about gentrification struggles, this seemed to come up over and over again, and also in relation to institutions. I remember in our conversation with Precarious Workers Brigade, one of our members said that she was at the college where she works, and the manager had held a meeting and stood on the stage and said, "Okay, I'm listening." I'm here to listen. As if that was creating a space that would then allow things to change. And of course, all it does is create a space for people to speak into, to feel that they've spoken. But then that stays within the walls of that space and is never allowed to actually change the institution or any of or anything around that.
Yeah, just just briefly to underline that, I think it's a very good question about Kate's book, which is about the history of radio, and it's a difficult thing to think about, the freedom to listen, because on its own, it can be important in the right context, but everything depends on the context. In other words, going back to your point about space, the key is the space in which the listening happens. Listening is a vector, it's directional. And if space is organised in such a way that the listening can't happen, or the speech can't be registered, it's a nothing. So it forces us to think about how space is actually organised, which is a much bigger issue than just listening or just voice, but it's actually the type, because it covers everything, it's exactly where art can intervene, because by organising a different type of space that is unlike the spaces we're used to, it challenges to think how unlike that is. And so that's exactly what you're doing in your work as you described it. So I think we have to move on from the actual act of listening and the freedom, which we can celebrate, to thinking about what gets in the way, which is about space itself in a broader way. That's for me the bigger lesson.
I think just a small, what strikes me very, very suddenly is that the notion of oral history, not in this sort of collective sense, that people have gone out and said, we need to listen to these people talking, let's go to them and record them. But I think in terms of all of these groups of people, communities of people everywhere, who have been doing very, very sort of practically, very, very much part of their lives, is passing on their history to the next generation. So they might, this storyteller will be telling their story to the next generation. And what's necessary is to pass it on in that sense, because perhaps they don't have, they don't want to write it down, or they perhaps at one point didn't. I mean, I just recently learned that the Somali language wasn't a written language until 1972. So this notion of passing on your history in that context, I think, is also very important. So I think what I'm trying to do is say it's wider than that. It's wider than just the discussion here in Housmans on Caledonian Road.
Jana was.
I think I've got a cord on my lap here. I wanted to say two things. One was just picking up on the point about space, having space for sort of freedom of listening. That I think it's sometimes the metaphor of the public sphere often keeps us within a kind of paradigm of space that doesn't acknowledge the importance of time, and and Paulo Freire has this great term, as does Bakhtin and other people, for the kind of marrying of time and space, which he describes as scope within kind of popular education practices, which is the ability to commit in time to what is heard, is equally or more important as the kinds of organization of space. And I think as artists and political activists who are very much tied into regimes of kind of visual representational modes, we sort of think in terms of how is the space organized, how has the public sphere laid itself in front of us in relation to speakers and listeners. But I think actually increasingly in our moment, time is becoming one of the crucial factors which disables our commitment to the kinds of freedoms of listening that we might imagine. And so this kind of marrying of the two for me is really crucial. And then the other thing is maybe just marrying what other people heard. I haven't read this book either, so we're just like riffing off this concept, not even knowing what it is. I'm very sorry to the author of the book, but also just the question of whose freedom, because within different kinds of spaces of listening that we've been involved in, where we've tried to rearrange practices of listening and speaking so that those who have not been speaking within particular organizations have the space to be heard, others will make a claim that denies their freedom of listening. And so, we have to be kind of, always cognizant, of course, of also the relationship between like free will, the kind of freedom attached to free will, that kind of listening, which is sort of cruising, listening to what you want, walking away if you feel like it, versus the kind of more committed forms of listening, which Freire and others would call a practice of freedom, but which relate to almost a discipline of freedom to a certain extent, and that kind of tension between discipline protocols and the notion of freedom is really important, particularly in dealing with injustice, unequal distributions of power, on the lines of many intersecting kinds of lines of oppression. Yeah.
I'll say something very quickly. Sorry, just in response. I was struck by that. Yeah, the freedom to listen obviously going to be the same constraints as the freedom of speech. We all know that freedom of speech is a very nebulous concept. But in Dundee, we did a project, an amazing project for a year with very working class artists who had quite severe mental health problems. And there was all sorts of political engagement around the city and the deindustrialisation and the poverty. But actually, in the end, the kind of things we were interested in looking at got set aside because they weren't interested in looking at those things. They wanted to look at the history in Dundee of why they had been involved previously and were still involved in setting up spaces to listen in, or actually to be listened in, because obviously going through the mental health system, the hospital system, they were never listened to. But it was that binary, those two things that were really interesting to me. It wasn't just a space to be listened in, it was also a space to listen, so they were very consciously setting up from their histories of actually being silenced through this deindustrialisation, through the stigma of mental health. They were very conscious they wanted to listen. But I was thinking how great that is also to deal with how confident that is to deal with this notion that the freedom to listen is always going to be really complicated on exactly what Jana said, the power of who's insisting upon that. We always know that we're always going to struggle against these kind of rights that we think are actually there, but it depends who we are.
Yes, in fact, linking a few things here, I think amnesty as a concept, even though it sounds pretty strange, is really important here and actually a missing ingredient. Because if we go back to the origin of the word amnestia, what it says, what it means, what it's meant to speak to us is actually thinking. It is about forgetting. It is about prescription of memory. And it's really up to us to include it into how we listen, how we speak, how we organize the space, how we, let's say, do not agree to forgetting, to the imposed forgetting, so that, I mean, I don't know, it just seems to me this is a very rough, like, or disarticulated moment for me. But I've been working on amnesty or amnestia within something completely different to do with dicta and the troubles that are to do with Joe Freeman and the tyranny of structuralistness. And it really struck me there how important that concept is, and it seems to me that it's really an operative principle in a sense that needs to be kind of thought about when we think about freedom to listen, freedom to speak, freedom in general, and the organization of space. That's all I wanted to say.
Any other questions from?
Yes, one who's been waiting a long time.
Hi, I was just curious because there was a big reference to 70s feminism, consciousness raising, and at least in my understanding of things, one of the big criticisms of, I'm just putting the positive things aside for now, but one of the big criticisms of that point in time was actually the lack of intersectionality, that there was really the voices that were heard were very particular and kind of exclusive around issues of race, class, really exclusive, say around trans issues. Trans women were extremely excluded at that point. And I'm curious now, this many years later, if those were issues that you looked at in terms of a critique on that, or how you positioned your new thoughts on listening today. And I guess it's really important of looking at, in terms of thinking about listening, that a big part of it is who is actually even in the room to be listened to. Are there a lot of people who are being excluded just by the means of not being in the space or not being welcome to the space, or for a whole host of reasons? So I was curious of the dynamics around all of that.
Well, I find quite interesting the position of Rihanna Cavarero on that, because she kind of reflects on both on the feminist spirit and on Errant, and I think the shift that she introduced is from this idea of politics-based identity politics, so what we could call pluralism to plurality. And plurality, she go back to Hannah Arendt thinking that plurality is the result of the interaction of different subjectivity, individuality. So it's actually valuing the singularity, the uniqueness. No? So we recognize the uniqueness of each person through the voice. This is why she connects this notion of uniqueness to voice. And I think this is interesting because it came out very much in PWB and Precarious Worker Brigade, in this collage of voices, because everybody could contribute with the book with their own voices at the same time. So there was the individual voices, but also the collective voice. And this double act, I think, is very interesting because allowed different way of recognizing, the other in front of you. I think it came up. Maybe you want to talk about a little bit about the tribunal. The tribunal example of PWB in 2011. They don't know one. Yeah.
I would ask Anna. Do you have anything to say?
PWB?
No, if you want to answer to the question that the lady.
I can say that it was certainly omitted. It wasn't there. It really wasn't there. I was very aware of it, but I didn't feel that I was able to voice it. I didn't feel I was able to voice it, not because I was scared to, because in fact the articulation of it wasn't there for me. I didn't know how to sort of talk about it. I was just very aware of it in myself. But I think that since then, I feel that having been part of it has allowed me to continue, and most certainly include it in what I talk about now, and how I express it now. But it was a major problem, and it did actually sort of stop. It excluded a lot of people. I just happened to be within a sort of group of people where somehow I was included, perhaps by default, almost. When I think about it, yeah. And I don't know. It's very interesting how in that sort of situation, you almost. I mean, it was the 70s as well. So you almost sort of you're not looking at. You're literally not looking at yourself. You're looking at other people. So they would have been seeing me as somebody who wasn't white, but I wasn't able to see myself. I don't mean that literally. I was very aware of not being white, but I wasn't able to see myself literally as not being white, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I just add that the conversation with both Anna and Pat Kaplan, the other feminist involved in consciousness raising in the 70s, both conversations acknowledged this issue very much, and we certainly, the main thing was that we wanted to take forward into the present was more of the principles, while recognizing that that there are, I think one of the first things to do in any listening practice is to acknowledge who's not there. I mean, that's certainly something that as PWB I think we have done sometimes. Yeah.
Way to go.
There's a way to go. Yeah.
I'd also say that just from Ultra-Red's perspective, that question around how different groups of people reshape kind of protocols of listening is really significant. So, for example, the Ultra-Red project that's in New York and has been for many years is embedded in the house ballroom scene, and the modes of listening that are produced there really differ from the modes of listening that you might see in a white feminist consciousness raising group. They're incredibly performative. They really push on the question of how listening is kind of contextualized. Are we sitting down and sort of talking to each other in this very sort of back and forth way, or are there more kind of performative, explosive modes of speaking and listening that are permitted? And so I think it's about who's in the room, but it's also again about these kind of protocols, because certain spaces police people's inclusion and exclusion ability to speak and listen based on the way they organize the kinds of protocols, not just who's in the room. So I think it's really, that those kinds of questions of speaking and listening that are emerging within queer spaces and trans spaces are really important to sort of think about the wider kind of context and question around listening right now. and have been excluded historically, but also have been developing really important protocols in the house ballroom scene. There are incredible, 20-year, 30-year protocols for thinking about trans-focused modes of listening. And so, it's not only about exclusion, it's about listening to the practices that are emerging in spaces where people have not been listened to within kind of mainstream culture.
I'd like to ask a question about the word consciousness and relationship between listening and consciousness. So, I've only read the first half of the book, so which might put me in some instances at this early stage. Sorry?
It's all on the last
one. Well, anyway, I'll continue. So consciousness, obviously, in this Freudian sense and the feminist sense of the 70s, as consciousness of the social and historical, political, economic context that we're in, as a means to individual and collective and social action. Yeah. But then consciousness, I'm wondering then whether what we're moving to, hopefully, with this book as a huge catalyst, is not just consciousness raising, which of course is still obviously vital, but consciousness transformation. And that listening as a bridge is not just a bridge to repair the social fabric, and not just a bridge to build organisations and institutions, but it's a bridge to actually end the illusion of individual, and to heal. And so I can't remember the name, gentleman in the pink shirt. Chris. So Chris is talking about how you with colleagues sit and listen to the sounds of your struggles, and then you think, well, how do we deal with that? For me, that is just the pain that keeps us separated. That all the trauma that we collectively have, as a group, as a society, and listening as therefore the act of love, the act of healing, and so what we all do is try and obviously run away from pain, and actually we've got to sit in it, and so and also just one final thing is that the lady over there, I don't know, from the PWB, who has many names, but the point is as well is that what that reveals obviously is one that all knowledge or culture is co-produced. You didn't know, but also that what was happening there was this, that the individuals were lost to this, and just finally, just rereading, early Marx, in the economic philosophical manuscripts, I was really shocked actually. Like, he's talking about communism as a society, as a state of being, and he uses the word spiritual 2 or 3 times. So unashamedly talking about love and the spirituality of definition of consciousness.
Just following on from that, I don't think that we are always, I'm not trying to challenge anything, but running away from pain. Sometimes I think it's like a comfortable thing that we have. It's like, it's kind of, we're used to it and we're safe to be in an uncomfortable place, if that makes sense. It's got like nothing to do with anything else, but just picked up on what you said.
I'd just reply about it's true, in that listening session we heard a lot of pain, and some people cried about some of their histories, but I think that collective moment was an act of love together also. It's not one thing or the other. Pain, maybe you're really experiencing pain or it triggers something, but in that kind of careful, generous moment around each other, it's not just static. That like all struggle is of course really difficult. How we keep going, I have no idea, but we keep going through other people helping us all the time. And that for me, being an ultra is that amazing collectivity, affinity, joy and pain, ability to cry or to whatever, is to me an amazing moment.
Process.
And just to kind of continue really. I think Chris, you were talking about listening and I'm going to kind of paraphrase you how I understood it, which is in a way, when you listen, you can't be thinking about what you're going to come back at. It's almost like a kind of is all kind of, we're used to kind of competitive listening, isn't it? Because then it's like, oh, can I come up with a cleverer thing?
A reference.
So we're kind of selfishly listening in a way, and I think from the experience of a kind of egoless or I don't know, but I think being in a collective space for me, and that I still don't quite fully, or maybe I can articulate, but I feel like it is a body, and it is a space, and it is a time, and it is a sense of the joy for me is when I disappear, and that's been happening a lot, and that's why, and it's kind of co-learning, and it is co-disappearing, and at the same time there's a kind of critical knowledge, so it's like, so we don't fall in love with each other in a way. I mean, we love each other, but we don't lose sense of our own privilege and the sense in which we privilege our, there's a kind of almost like a kind of sense of like a kind of critical, self-critical knowledge. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but it's a bit like, you can also just be, oh, it's so lovely being together, yeah? But, why are we together? What is the politics, of the space and time and that we're together? So I just wanted to...
We might have some time for some questions.
Yeah, just to check, 'cause it's 8:30 now.
Yeah,
so I don't know if anyone has any final questions or comments. Yeah.
It's very interesting having been asked the question about about the issue of race. I then looked around the room, and I'm very sad to say that there aren't too many people who are not white in this room. So how far have we actually gone? And again, I don't, was it exclusion? I don't know. But we need to, like everything else, we need to continue to think about it. I don't think that as a woman, I'm talking to other women here, that we now all feel strong and powerful and we can stand up at any moment and say what we want to say and listen to other women who are around. So we haven't resolved that. But I think there's a lot of women here, and that's great. But there aren't a lot of faces that are not white here. So something is still needs to be addressed. Sorry to have to sort of say that in this situation.
I think that's the sort of criticality. It's like, okay,
constructive comment.
Who is not here?
I think any other question?
Just wanted to put the dot on the E on something. Can you say that? On something. So, for me, when we speak about it, I think in the book you use Adriana Cavarero, another feminist of self-consciousness raised in 1970s and 80s, but it's important to remember not to put all 70s and 80s feminism into a bundle altogether. Because, for instance, Italian feminism, self-consciousness raised in 70s and 80s was very different from American feminism, British feminism, French, Spanish, Eastern European, Turkish feminist in the 70s. So, and we need to look as well at the social, political, and structures of the time of each country. For instance, Italy didn't have many migrants until the beginning of the 80s, some migrants, and more so end of the 80s, and then from the 2000s. So in the 70s and beginning of the 80s, Italy wasn't a country where people migrated to. So specifically, self-conscious Italian feminism in the 70s and 80s didn't have many black women or from other countries.
In fact, to be clear is that, I mean, we said in the introduction that our aim was not to cover all the history. It was just to start thinking back to that. It's just the beginning, really, because that is a huge work to actually look at different kind of feminism and different practices and stuff. But hopefully, this will bring it back the interest and see how this works in terms of now and political organizing now. So that is the aim of the book, really. Thank you anyway for your E on the dot. Or E on the dot and the E.
It was more than the book, because I haven't read it yet. It's more for the comments about whether there was intersectionality. It depends from each country.
But perhaps the southern Italian women could have been perceived as actually standing in for what later became the black.
Yeah. I could have carried on. I was thinking already before that the southern Italian women who migrated in the north, but many became feminists as well. They were part of the feminist conscious raising, and I can name a few.
Is somebody in the back? No. Yeah. Maybe I can just toss it out, and then if someone, I can just toss this out, and if maybe talk to one of you guys after if anyone has anything to add. I was sort of thinking about what it means to ask someone to endure listening, and sort of who has been enduring, and to what extent people are continually asked to endure, and specifically who might be asked to endure, and what does that mean about creating a space for listening. I guess, that was my thoughts on that, and maybe someone can respond later or now, or because I know we want to move on.
Well, that was what democracy was meant to be about, but it's very rare when politicians are required to endure listening. It's extremely rare, and we feel sorry for them and so on and so forth. But it's very important when it happens. Very important.
Wasn't it more? Was your point more about the people that it falls on the responsibility? Yes. It falls on a specific section of society more than others to always listen or to do that active, generous thing, whereas other people.
Particularly women of color who disproportionately engage in care work, and the listening of care work is, and the kind of distribution of care work to particular, segments of communities is incredibly problematic around questions of listening, and the very thing that makes us maybe want to valorize listening from a feminist perspective has also been a source of oppression for many women who have had to struggle with the burden of listening. Not always women, but very often women. So I think this question of the endurance of listening, and also again back to the protocols and the questions of how do you redistribute the kind of labor of listening, because care work and the effective kind of practices of listening are forms of labor also. They're not just kind of nice things that we do. They're exploited forms of labor right now. So part of the idea of sort of bringing listening, I think, into the center of the conversation is to valorize it enough in the same way that we, wages for housework and these kinds of feminist kinds of practices mobilized and tried to bring questions of social reproduction into the center of politics. This is the question of listening, I think, is very much tied to that for the reason that you're talking about, but I think it's a really useful way to think about it, not only as a kind of positive, listening as a positive kind of practice, but as a practice of labor, and sometimes very hard and difficult labor.
Should we stop there then?
I think we should have some time for more drinks and
it's hot. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. Please grab a beer if you want one, and also the bookshop closes at 9. We need to leave at 9, but we will recamp to the pub across the road if anyone wants to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's the most important announcement.